Hey out there, all you Ethicuties, and welcome to the Ethicsverse. You are officially in the coolest place to be, right here on the Ethicsverse. Your eyes are not deceiving you. Nick did not get less handsome. It's me, Gio. I'm glad to be here. Hi guys, I'm Gio Gallo. I'm excited to be in the session with you today on Rethinking Risk, Modernizing Traditional Assessments. We'll get to the team in a minute. We have the inestimable, the coolest guy in compliance, Matt Kelly here, and we have Rupert Eville here to talk with us about assessments. And we're glad you're here. So thanks for joining us. In case you haven't heard, Nick got in an accident, so Nick's going to be off the Ethicsverse for a couple weeks. So thank you for all of you out there who have wished him well, sent him LinkedIn messages. The outpouring of love and support and care for Nick means a lot to me personally and our family, and to him as well. So throw a heart and a thumbs up for Nick. Keep those emojis coming. Cool. We're pouring in. We're all hungry for emojis this morning. I guess it's afternoon now. So let's jump into it. Welcome to the Ethicsverse. Glad that you're here. Please get your phone out, put it on the screen. Jump on this link for the Ethicsverse survey. Your input and your feedback is invaluable to us. We say here at Ethico that feedback is a gift. So you can give someone a gift just by giving some of your input. So jump on there and get that link with the QR code to the Ethicsverse survey. Okay, so if you've been here at all, you know that at Ethico on the Ethicsverse, we love learning. So let's learn, and want to highlight the ways that, as a member of the Ethicsverse, hopefully you're subscribed. If you're just showing up, find that subscribe button and subscribe to the Ethicsverse so you could join us every week. But we have a range of awesome books here. We have a bunch of stuff that we post on social for your benefit and to help us all learn together. We have a bunch of books, so stay tuned for our famous book giveaway. But check out our Ethicsverse page for some of our favorite podcasts, some amazing books. A bunch of us were at SCCE, at the CEI in Texas earlier this week, and we gave out a bunch of these books. So if you didn't make it by the booth, or you couldn't make it in person there to Gaylord, Texas, then you have a chance on the Ethicsverse every week to win a book in our famous, world famous book giveaway. All right, so here's your QR code for that. Jump in that to see our library and learn some more. So if you haven't been checking what's coming up on the Ethicsverse, we're super excited to be releasing our next episode with Julie Winkle-Giulioni. She had some great input for us and some great ways to level up your program. So please check out the latest Ethics Experts episode. All right, FCPA Survival Guide. You too can survive the treacherous road through FCPA. We all love the voice of compliance, Tom Fox. Nick is featured on this. Check out the YouTube episodes. I think it's like 8 or 10 quick episodes, and check out this book if your program is part of, and part of your responsibility is for covering the FCPA regulations. Then you want to check this out and sharpen up. Okay, so a bunch of what we love and talk about is crowdsourcing risk intelligence at scale, and you can't do that without getting your employees engaged. People who work here are all always aware of how important it is to drive a speak up culture. And on average, E&C programs get only 1.6 reports per 100 employees. There's some of that you're going to find out, but there's a bunch of intelligence around your organization that's going to managers. In a lot of ways, if the manager isn't the one driving the problem, a bunch of employees are going to go to their manager as kind of their first route, and employees are 6 to 8 times more likely to report something to their manager. So what do you do about that? Well, you're certainly not going to tell them, don't tell your manager anything, just come to compliance. We're all going to be working together. So what we've done here at Ethico is we put out this middle manager toolkit. This is your ethics secret weapon. And if you grab this QR code and jump on the middle manager's toolkit, we have a bunch of ways that you can engage the managers around your organization and make them part of your team, not just by telling them what to do, but by engaging with them, making it easier for them to find answers, to promote your compliance program. People have been loving, if you guys don't have these ethics images for your email signatures, we got a bunch of images that promote ethical mottos and promote parts of your ethics and compliance program. check out the Middle Manager Toolkit. There are white papers. There are just lists and lists of ideas of how you can engage middle managers who are not formally employed in the compliance department, but we say compliance is culture, and you need those middle managers to be part of your compliance culture. All right, the ecosystem is our Ethico platform for managing your ethics and compliance program. So check us out. People are loving us on G2. The only thing that people love more than the ecosystem is the Ethicsverse. So if you want to check it out, check us out on G2 Crowd and see if the things that we do and the things people do on the ecosystem platform can be something that can be part of your next phase of leveling up your program. So, famous book giveaway by Rupert, Bootstrapping Ethics. You guys, if you've read this book, you know you got to read it again. If you have one book, you got to buy another one. We're giving a couple books away, but you got to check out Rupert's book here. The genius that you're going to see coming off of Rupert today is just poured into this book on bootstrapping ethics, how you don't need to wait until 15 years from now or wait until you have your ideal budget or everything lines up. You can bootstrap your ethics program and get the right things done and start moving forward. So scan this QR code to enter our book giveaway. You got 5 books coming at you today. Okay, so you have a chance to win it. And if you don't win it, then one of the best investments you can make is an investment in your knowledge and your abilities. So a great way to do that is to grab Rupert's book on bootstrapping ethics. All right, we are offering at Ethico. If you guys haven't been getting enough free stuff from Ethico recently, the books and the Ethicsverse, if you like that sort of thing, what we're doing is we're offering up to 1 free year on any new service. So a lot of people are concerned about the overlap when they're switching, or the cost of implementing a new system, or whatever might be holding you back and shackling you to a an old platform that isn't built to suit what you need. For people who come over here to Ethico, we want to invest in a long-term relationship. And part of how we're going to do that, we're going to say, hey, you know what? We'll pay for the first year. So switch to our services without any of the stress. Don't worry about your early termination fees or overlapping your services to make sure it goes smoothly. We have a world-class implementation team that's going to do that. But the timing and part of the cost of your contract, or potentially all of it for that first year, is going to be on us, because we think that it's going to be worth it, and we want to make it easier for you and your team to get the upgrade in your software, in your program, so you can drive a better culture. Okay, so before I put all this flesh on, I had a bunch of machine body parts around here, and this is what I used to look like. Hopefully, you guys like the jacket better than me showing all my my metal cyborg shoulder pads to you guys. But I'm Gio Gallo. I'm co-CEO and here at Ethico, and I've spent a bunch of my career around growth companies and Fortune 500 companies, driving growth, driving culture, and driving innovation. And I'm excited to be here with you guys today to learn some about assessments. Matt Kelly is the editor and CEO of Radical Compliance. If you're not subscribed to Radical Compliance, you got to get on this newsletter. Matt is a world-class writer, reporter, and thought leader on all things compliance. You got to jump in there and follow Matt. I can't get enough of them. For an hour or so on Thursday is great, but get some more of that genius that Matt is offering and subscribe to Radical Compliance. And we're excited to have Rupert Avil here, the founder of Human Risk. He's a behavioral science led consulting area and training firm, and Rupert has really thoughtful insights into specific things like we're talking about today on assessments, and a host of other things around your compliance program, how to level up and bootstrap your ethics program. He's a great thought leader and very engaging. And if you're not connected with Rupert on LinkedIn, then jump in and follow Rupert, the founding director of Ethics Insight. So Matt, I think we're ready for you to jump into modernizing risk assessments.
Sure. Happy to be here, Gio. And I am just going to say my first question right away. When they have AI generate the cyber versions of us, I'm curious why AI thought I would need a cyber hat. But we are pleased to be here. So for everybody who is joining us, thank you very much for showing up. We are here today to talk about risk assessments, something that Rupert has worked on quite a bit, and he has a lot of thoughts about that. as always, for everybody listening, if you have any questions along the way, you can either put them directly into the attendee chat. We will see them. We'll try and answer them as they come along as soon as we can. Or you can put them into the Q&A function as well, and we'll save them up. Theoretically, we like to dedicate the last 10 minutes or so to Q&A from the audience. In reality, you ask a lot of good questions. When we see a good one, we try and tackle it immediately. So the more questions people have, the better it is for you all. We're happy to do it. Rupert, I wanted to start simply by asking you, why are we here talking about risk assessments? Because in theory, compliance officers think about risk assessments all the time. They think about how they need to assess risk effectively. But the very fact that we're having this discussion does mean that, risk assessments are challenging. Are we missing some better way to think them through, to get them done? You have done a lot of work with risk assessments at companies large and small in North America, around the world, in Europe. What are your observations about what we need to rethink to be able to get ahead of the risk assessment challenges of the modern world?
Well, yeah, I think you've already summed up some of the points, which is that there are certain organizations with significant resources that are going to be managing it very well. And they probably would be able to sort of run this session. But the reality is where I spend most of my time is where that's a bit more challenging. So it's easiest to give an example. And this morning I was on a call with an organization that the organization itself is relatively new. It's renewable energy in a sort of tech disrupting way. The management team have been working together for 15 years across other businesses in healthcare and other things. And so then when we looked at the risk framework, it was a mixture of a legacy ERM system from healthcare, trying to sort of belt on some environmental and social risk assessment stuff that had been done by one investor. And then I said, well, what about the compliance bit? And they said, it's money laundering. And I was like, okay, that's curious because, why did you start there with a renewable energy company where you have one customer, which is the off-taker, and not a whole lot of third parties at this stage? And so they said, because the IFC told us to. And then when we start to sort of unpick it, what we realize is that risk assessment in many organizations is a kind of a legacy thing that might have come out of health and safety, maybe out of security. And now we're getting other areas that are getting involved from sort of the cybersecurity, social performance, environmental. The regulators in the compliance space keep bringing out guidance or what you should do in a risk assessment. So like the UK Bribery Act, where I'm sat, it has a very sort of specific way that you're meant to do it, the country, sector, transaction, business opportunity, etc. And so when you bring all this together, you have an awful lot of overlap that unfortunately can sometimes lend itself to one of two things. If there's overwhelm, it becomes checklists. And if there's maybe if you're, or the alternative is that you're just trying to kind of cobble together something to satisfy almost the regulation rather than right-sizing it to your organization. So you end up creating a huge volume of work just complying with risk assessment provisions rather than actually doing a three-dimensional assessment of the external operating environment, your internal controls, and your culture to manage those risks.
Let me pick up on that since you said if there's too much work, eventually it falls into a checkbox. And I guess I'm kind of wondering whether we should be surprised at that bad habit, that for a long time, that was okay. And some organizations might not be sure what to do. So they think, well, if we just tick all of the boxes they told us to tick, that means we're in the good graces with the regulators. Now, I have problems with that because you could have a really nice compliance system and then some other non-regulated risk blows up in your face. So yes, we're regulatory compliant, but the company's still burning down around our ears. So I struggle with how we got into this bad habit. And I think a lot about the default into being a checklist. What would you say about all of that? And how real is that threat that we miss what's really out there?
Yeah, it is very, it's really significant. So that, again, another anecdote of an e-learning company that's run by a contact I know called up and said, we need anti-bribery and corruption management system and assessment. And I was like, okay, it's a subscription-based e-learning offering that at that time was mainly domestic in Australia, they weren't dealing with any government entities. It was a scale up. And I was like, okay, that's curious. Why are we starting there? And they go, oh, the bankers told us to. And I think one of the things we have to remember sometimes is that, if a regulator or an investor or a client or a lender tells you to do something, your senior management are going to jump. And I empathize with that. I run my own business now, and I in the first few years, I was very susceptible to advice from people in areas I didn't fully understand, like marketing, for example. And so the job of the people in charge of the business is not intuitively to be risk managers. So there is always that challenge. The other challenge is that the regulators are writing their guidance at a kind of a best practice high, trying to cover everyone level often. And so then, if you were to put it in another context outside of compliance, you start to see how crazy that is. So if I said to you, here's the best practice for building a premises, you might go, where? Well, are we talking about a bank downtown in North America, or are we talking about like an aid facility in Sudan? Because the building code cannot sit in the same universe for those two things. But if you are a regulator and you're trying to write the guidance of what a risk assessment should involve or what best practice is, you necessarily have to kind of pitch it. So the response I would always say to an organization is the first thing is we've got to kind of make it relevant to what it is you actually do. Then we have to, after we've made it more relevant, then the right sizing comes. So, okay, we've identified corruption is an exposure, but right sizing is about where? Is that third parties? Is that winning business? Is that facilitation payments? Because depending on your nature of your business, the risk even within that class of compliance is going to be further nuanced. And then finally, it needs to be made relatable, because a risk assessment should be something people can action. So it's not just some spreadsheet sitting somewhere where you've identified things that, to your point, then aren't socialized across the business. And so it is a big challenge, but just to try and get it relevant, right size, relatable.
If I could even back up just a bit, because I'd wanted to ask a bit about how do we get started? How do we identify the drivers of risk? But you did say something a few minutes ago that stuck with me, where a lot of senior managers don't necessarily see themselves as risk managers, or they don't think about operations in that way. And I kind of wonder, should compliance officers start even just by sitting down with operations people, say, yes, you are risk managers, even if you don't know it, or you might be thinking about some risks, like I'm sure head of sales is thinking all the time about what is the risk I don't make the big sale, or I lose a big client, or I don't miss my numbers. But there are other risks that they might not be aware. It's kind of also your job to think about them. Like, how do you build that sense of understanding and a consensus about we're going to need to think about risk effectively? How do you build that consensus with senior managers or operations leaders or the board that they're thinking about it the same way you are? Is that a step that has to happen early on?
I think so, and I think the people, the compliance officers who I see do that very skillfully, they tend to avoid the risk words, in the sense that I started out, my first interaction with risk assessment was in 2001, just after 9/11. Counterterrorism was what I was first working in, and so in that context, it was just full of jargon, the modus operandi, this, that, and the other. And we'd go and sometimes speak to senior leaders, and we'd just get blank faces because so the first thing I would say is to get people aware of risk, stop using risk terminology, which I know is a bit counterintuitive, but use the terminology of the business. So if it's an engineering firm, then you'll hear things like critical path a lot. If it's, tech, and that they're used to moving fast and breaking things, we might do pre-mortems. But what I would be talking to people about is, what are the things, what's the core of this organization? What keeps it running? What could derail it? Who do you deal with? How do you deal with them? What would happen if this? So we're just doing the what, who, when, where type questions to try and kind of get them thinking about. The first step, I would argue, is getting them thinking about the universe of interactions that organization has, because a lot of the time that's where the risk lies. Then we can start to kind of dig down into particular areas. But what I found from bitter personal experience, like in traveling around with that rolled up risk matrix in this huge sort of bazooka thing, trying to get that through customs in 50 countries around the world there, and then going into an organization and then speaking to people and saying, right, what's the likelihood of this happening? What's the impact? It can be very baffling. And part of the reason is if we look at the origin of that risk assessment frameworks, a lot of them come from things that are a bit more quantifiable than compliance. So we might have like insurance modeling data, or we might be able to say that if we have a fire at this facility, we can estimate this might be the probable maximum loss. And whereas what I would say in the challenge in compliance is that it's very, very difficult to do some of the estimations. So corruption is a good example. What is the impact? Is it the impact of saying no and then not winning business? Is it the impact of bribing, getting caught? Is it the impact of bribing, not getting caught? That's not a very big thing. Is it the impact of the refusing to comply and then having your business frustrated because it's a highly corrupt market? So we can get ourselves really tied in knots if we're using all of that risk jargon, whereas a better way of approaching it is looking at what is integral to the business and what are we trying to seek to avoid, and start there, because that's already prioritizing.
It's interesting. Let me weave in a comment from one of the listeners here who says, checklist-based approaches can be overly prescriptive, constraining the assessor's ability to identify unconventional or emerging risks. A, that is correct. B, I also think it's very much on point with what you were just saying now, Rupert, about the jargon, because that's where it appears a lot of times, is in the framework, in the checklist. And there is a bad habit of falling in love with your own checklist in your own language rather than thinking about, okay, what's actually going to disrupt our business in a real way, and how would you describe it to somebody else, a friend or a colleague or your spouse or something like that. And I've never heard anybody say, well, I take a risk-based approach. They never say that at the cocktail party. But actually, Gio, I don't want to leave you overlooked here. One question I thought about, and I don't know if you have any comments, was just how familiar this sounds, what Rupert is describing, that a lot of large organizations default to what they know, what they've been told to worry about. And it can be really hard to kind of think imaginatively about what are new risks and how are we going to figure out what to do with them. I don't know if you have any observation of that in, your own talking with clients or whatnot, or your own experience about just how hard it is to think in the right sort of way about what a real risk is.
Yeah, I mean, it's there's a through line for this, and really a bunch of things that were sessions at the conference earlier this week. And like the trend that I'm seeing is so many compliance and ethics teams are on a tight budget. They have the whole company that they need to take care of, and they need to get their arms around all these risks. And a lot of times when you're stressed or rushed or whatever, you kind of start with you don't transform the inputs too much, right? You read the regulation that is, written by regulators, maybe for consumption by your team, and then you transfer a bunch of those things directly into the assessment. And part of what we need to do to be effective, right? Because, Rupert was talking about this earlier. What's the goal, right? What are we trying to do? We're not just trying to do a risk assessment. We're not just trying to get a rating or force rank some of these things. We're trying to take action. And a lot of times the way you take that action is through people around you. We were talking about middle managers and stuff like that. And the way you need to do that is you need to be able to have some buffer, or just like you were saying, Matt, have some time that you spend to reflect on what you're writing or how you're talking about it, and seeing how it's going to land with someone who they spend all their time thinking about marketing, or they spend all their time thinking about M&A or whatever it is. And it starts with that empathy that so many of us have because we care about what we're doing. But when you're rushing through it, or your risk matrix has certain words on it, it's hard to take that extra time to reprocess it so that it's easier to digest by the people you're working with. So it's not, I'm not going to say just take more time and do it better because I know that's hard, but I would just try to push people to realize that there's so much work that you do, educating yourself, getting your process ready, getting your risk framework set up. The ultimate action where the wheels, where the tires meet the road is really in that interaction with somebody when you're talking to them, interviewing them, getting their ratings on these things, and spending a little bit of that time in, hey, how does this land with this person who's out in the field all the time, or this person who, views the world this way because of the job that they have. Finding that, having that empathy and just asking yourself, how could I say this in a way that's easier for them to get what we're talking about? There's really high return on that. We're all looking for ROI in our program, and just that action of translating that last mile of how do I get someone to interact with this in the right way is so worth it, because it can transform your relationship with that person, how relevant this is, and ultimately the information you get out of it.
Here's another really good comment from one of the listeners. A lot of leadership see risk management as a downer of a conversation, and then they try to separate it from the strategy. Rupert, tell me what you think about that and how to get them back on, because when you say it like that, the way the attendee did, you have to wonder, what are these senior leaders, what planet are they on, that they think that managing the risk should be, something that nobody wants to think about? Let's just put that at the end after I come up with my great idea. That's a terrible way to run a business and set an objective and figure out how to achieve it. So where does that come from, and what would you say to this person? Because I think it's an excellent insight. It
is, and it's something I've seen repeatedly. But it's a tricky one to answer, because we have to be pragmatic. We're not going to be able to change everyone to start with. But I've seen some organizations where there's different approaches I've seen, and I'm not saying I would stick to any one, because it really depends on your organization. One of them, for example, when they were doing their kind of addressable market and their market impact studies and looking at their strategic planning for the next 5 years, we were doing a risk overlay of those subsections of the market. What risk profile do they present? What would you need to do to insulate yourselves from that risk? So you're positioning it rather as a blocker, but how might you enable? So for example, if you're an infrastructure developer, then in most countries, certain parts of infrastructure might have better or worse governance. So can we be targeting or honing in on those where we're going to have a slightly de-risked possibility? And so that there is you can sort of make it as if you can get it into that strategic agenda. In terms of how to get management's attention, I think it's very much a personality-led thing, and in terms of and culture as well of the organization, in terms of going back to what is it that makes that organizational critical, and then doing some pre-mortem work of well, here's where compliance might negatively intersect with that core thing that makes us, and therefore if we work backwards, this is how we might avoid it. So you're positioning yourself as someone who's protecting them. I've seen a lot of people try and do look at all the big scary fines. The only situations I've seen that work are where it really seemed credible. So I did a lot of work in Japan a while back, and at one stage there were 23 Japanese executives in US prisons for various violations, so we had their attention. Similarly, I've seen investors, I work a lot with impact investors, they will have the attention of the management team because the management team want the funding. So sometimes you can look for allies in other critical stakeholders, but there's no one way to kind of get the managers on board with that. It will very much depend on your organization. But again, I would default to using whatever the language is of what you do. So for example, if you're explaining to your management their big plan, whether it's a product launch or a key project, if you're explaining to them how what you do can enable that project to succeed without catastrophic things happening, that's maybe a more compelling proposition than saying we need to comply with this because the regulators have told us to. So it's about making it as relatable as you can to them.
Yeah, I think that's great, Rupert. And I think there's a piece of it tied to your earlier point of, what is the goal? And I think that if, as practitioners, we can go into this and say, yes, I have a job to do. I'm going to do an assessment. It's going to get a rating, and then it's going to drive some stuff in my program that, we can protect. You got to try to zoom out of that, right? You got to try to put your executive hat on and, do the work for the person you're trying to get on board for why they should care about it, right? Because they don't really care about, having an assessment or having a risk rating or anything like that. But, I've been pushing this concept into my own communication and people around me of putting the bottom line up front. And the bottom line that you want to start with is not, hey, I need you to fill out this matrix. The bottom line is compliance and ethics wants to be an enabler of the business. We want to help our strategy succeed. And part of how we're going to do that is by finding some of the things that we'll regret doing later that might make you backtrack or lose money or lose position in the market. And hey, boss, hey, executive, whoever's engaging, I know you're trying to do a bunch of this stuff. My job is to come around you and make sure you can keep doing that stuff. And I think if you start with that goal and say, hey, instead of saying, I'll come back in 6 months and tell you what we found out and what we've done, say, hey, we're probably going to be doing these kind of things. And if we do it well, you'll be running faster and not have to kind of take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. I think if you can start with that goal and have that be the start of your conversation, it can really transform how that engagement goes. And they say, oh, you're trying to help me do my job. This isn't about just you doing your job. To your point, Rupert, like that conversation is going to go differently with different people and personalities. But, if you start with the end in mind and have that empathy for what they want, I think we can all get the job done together.
I see both of you in your recent remarks have generated a lot of little hearts and other emojis floating up across the screen. We're clearly touching the right nerve. Rupert, let me ask you this question. Who manages risk better? Would it be large organizations with lots of resources, or is it smaller organizations that have lots of frontline experience and they are more versatile and able to pivot depending on what they find since they're so close to the front line? Maybe do like a compare and contrast between the large and the small, and what could they learn from each other?
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is it will also depend on personality. So if the management team, whether large or small, has had skin in the game, then it's, if they've been on the front line at some juncture, that's always easier for me to then make those points. But if I were to try and sort of give a more generalized categorization, I think if you think about risk assessment and management as prevention, detection, and response, the larger organizations will generally obviously have more comprehensive systems. They will have more professionalism around the education of their people generally. The challenge would be in larger organizations ensuring that the messages are hitting the right people. In a smaller organization, oh, this person's in charge of procurement there, I need to speak to them about risk Y. Whereas to give an example of a project I've been working on recently, it's for a multilateral organization that does a lot of financing activities across Africa. And so they have hundreds of employees and they want to roll out like a one size ethics, compliance, fraud, anti-bribery, conflict, the full thing. And one of the challenges is explaining, well, we're going to need to segment that into learner groups because the person working the post room has a very different interaction with risk to someone who's negotiating, multi-billion-dollar trade finance deals. And so the large organizations, they have the infrastructure around education and prevention often way better than smaller ones. Sometimes there's a challenge with deployment. The large organizations would typically have much better detection tools. Like I'm doing surveys at the moment around, there's a bit of legislation here in the UK called the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act, which puts fraud on parity with bribery, essentially. It makes the failure to prevent a thing. And so I've been curious as to how predominantly UK or subsidiaries based here of international companies are managing that risk. And what we've seen is a surprising increase in analytics. And so the data-led stuff definitely more present in large organizations. The large organizations also have more maturity as a generalization around formalized speak-up frameworks, which is what Gio was talking about earlier. So that would be where I would put them. In terms of the smaller ones where they do better is the leaders are often much more answerable to stakeholders. So to your point around getting a leader's attention, I found that's a hell of a lot easier because they have big clients or they have lenders or they have investors who want them to do this stuff properly because if they don't, they lose their investment or in funds, etc. So you have their attention way more than you do with a senior group as a generalization. Because they're closer to the front line, they're a lot more focused on what I would call the call to action. They're the people who say, well, what do we need to do? How do we manage this? So they're much more tactically minded in terms of risk identification. And on the response element, they tend to learn a bit more quickly from mistakes and have, even if it's not formalized, the continuous improvement and root cause analysis actually tends to be quite intuitive. Whereas in large organizations, sometimes that can fall through the gap. So one thing I just wanted to read to you, it's not a very good visual slide, But I've got up. This is from an impact investing project where they're investing in an agribusiness that supplies like citrus and avocados to all of Europe. And these guys are on the ground in high-risk environments. In some of the countries they operate, they're interacting with sort of threats from like ISIS-affiliated groups, so very high risk. And their training on compliance essentially starts off with things like if someone tries to bribe you, and it gives you these very tactical things to keep yourself safe, but to make sure you don't get shaken down. And I've never seen that slide in a large multinational. The sort of acknowledgement that we actually face these risks, and if someone is going to, what to do when you're put in extreme pressure in those situations. So we might get scenarios in some of the training, but that I thought was a good illustration of they're so close to the risk that they're actually communicating it in a very compelling way to the employees, a practical way to the employees. So I think that would be sort of the distinctions I draw between the two sort of groups.
I love that language of keep yourself safe and keep yourself from being shaken down. I think the way that we approach this so often, maybe not so often, but there's a risk that, we think that we're trying to convince bad guys to do something good. And that language is appealing to their self-interest and assuming that they need some help doing the right thing or, looking out for it or whatever, not that we're trying to convince them to work against their best interest. And, just that language is so powerful. It's similar to a comment in here. Douglas, thanks for jumping in. He's suggesting that talk about risk, not that the risk is the risk of not meeting organizational objectives or in turn not getting compensated the way you want to, right? Like we so often are at risk of just myopically focusing on this is a bad thing or, regulators aren't going to like it. But if you say, hey, the risk I'm trying to do with my risk assessment is the things that are going to keep our organization from succeeding. These are the things that are going to keep you from getting your promotion or getting your stock price where you want it or whatever. And I'm trying to help that thing. Just that relatability and that language can change it. And I think sometimes we maybe don't notice that distinction or that it might come across a different way. We just don't know how to communicate it because we're like, yeah, obviously that's the whole point of ethics and compliance is to support the mission of the company. But we have to say those things and you have to say them a bunch for people to really engage the way you want to. Matt, you mind if I throw in another Q&A in here?
Go right ahead.
Okay, so Divya is jumping in. Thank you, Divya, for being so active in the Q&A here. So she said, how can organizations effectively balance the need for risk mitigation with the pursuit of innovation and growth? To me, that seems kind of tied into this. We're trying to support that, forward motion of the company. What do you guys think? Do you guys see those as those two things being opposed to each other, or how do you suggest we engage in this assessment to balance the desire for growth and innovation?
I will let Rupert go first. I have a couple of tips and thoughts I've seen, but I'd love to hear Rupert's thoughts on this first.
I'll try and keep it succinct because I'd like to hear your views too. But I think sometimes we can learn from other areas. So you probably have heard from cyber and other areas, security by design. So one of the first things is that there's not much point in innovating and putting something out there if it's going to create, to your point, Gio, if it's going to create risk to the business. And we've seen examples of organizations that have moved too quickly to market with products that have then been vulnerable to some form of risk or other, and that's undermined that organization's position. So I would say that it's just a sensible thing, particularly in this day and age, to assume that whatever you're putting out there, adversaries might seek to undermine. So it's a sensible thing to kind of factor in the risk decisions. In terms of the growth, I would go back to what I said earlier, which is thinking about things less in terms of a binary risk constraints growth, but more what is the addressable market. So, if you are, so let's say you're in healthcare and you're trying to expand into complex emerging markets, you might find that there's very different standards of governance between different regions within a country, or maybe the public and the private sector. So you can at least start and learn your lessons in the sector, which is slightly better governed. So you're still going for growth, and you're still doing growth in a scaled way like most organizations would, but you're also just being mindful of it's best to learn in a more benign risk environment than to go just jump in blind and go, let's just go for growth's sake. So I'll stop there because I'd quite like to hear what Matt has to say as well.
Well, first, I think it's an interesting question because when you think about it, smaller companies are better at innovation, and they're, I would argue, probably worse at risk management because it's new and they don't quite know what to do. And in larger companies, it is the opposite. Generally, they are better at risk management in a more structured way, and a lot of them are terrible at innovation because they just like doing what they do and they want to innovate a little bit more to goose the profits a tiny bit more, but they don't want radical innovation because they don't know how to handle it. But where I have seen larger companies strike a good balance between the two is sort of to define some boundaries for how different parts of the enterprise would innovate. And I'll give you a specific example that has stuck with me for many years now. This was probably 10 or 15 years ago. I was talking with executives at a large fast food company struggling with how to innovate using social media, which is just coming onto the scene. I will not name this company. However, if you have eaten a chicken McNugget, you can guess who they are. But they had said, basically, because they have a lot of franchisees who are largely independent and can do a lot of experimentation, they said, we, the parent, will first risk assess any innovation you come to us with, any one franchisee. And we'll do a test case. We'll sandbox how you want to do a certain social media campaign. We'll think about data collection and privacy and cybersecurity. And once we validate that this innovation is secure to roll out at scale, any franchisee anywhere can go ahead and run with it because we've already said this is the good housekeeping seal of approval from HQ. But they also said you are not allowed to innovate on your own. You can do what we've already said, and here's the use case, and you can fiddle with it as much as you'd like, but you can't do something whole cloth, totally new. And I always thought that was really smart for larger organizations. It's also, if you are a larger organization, you might have the luxury of an internal audit function, and you could probably ask them, please keep an eye on the emergent risks. And when you see that maybe there is an emergent risk that is from even our own innovation that could cause us operational risks or compliance risks, somebody's launching a new product, somebody's launching into a new market, please give us a heads up that we might be missing something. So you could collaborate with some other parts of the enterprise to make sure that innovation doesn't get away from you, that you can keep an eye on it, even though it's running out front. Everybody might now notice, Matt, you didn't say much about how smaller companies can do it. And I will admit, I bet it's more challenging for smaller companies. I'm not quite sure that I have a good answer for them, but it's a very good question. I wanted to go on to another question I had, Rupert, that we had discussed earlier. Everybody's favorite topic when worrying about risks is silos of risk assessment. Yes. I would say that clearly there's room for some place for some siloed risk assessment, that some parts of the organization are better at it than others. You have an environmental and health team. They're better at analyzing environmental risks. But how could compliance or senior management sort of cobble together everything that's rising up from those silos? I guess if we have images of smokestacks and there's smoke of insight about risk coming from the silos, how do you scoop it all together so that you have a good holistic sense of what's really going on across all of these silos? What advice would you give there?
So it's the beginning of the answer is quite boring. We need to have a bit of consistency. So I was speaking to, again, earlier today, speaking to another organization. They are a fund, again, and they are investing in all kinds of emerging businesses. And they've had advisors do an E&S risk assessment framework. They have a kind of legal risk, and they're all separate. And so then now wondering, do we keep these standalone? And so my suggestion was, no, if we can align on the terminology and have a roughly similar approach. And the reason for that is because if you think about, I'm going to use some risk language now, and I wouldn't necessarily use this with a business person, but everyone here is a specialist in this area. Look for overlap in the source of the risk. So, if, for example, it's a particular third-party risk exposure you face, or maybe regulatory, because if that is spanning multiple areas of risk, then that's a useful way to bring the silos together. look at the drivers, and the drivers of risk often is a mixture of everything you've got in your organization in terms of data from employees. So if you have good employee pulse stuff, speak up data, exit interviews, anything like that, and then we can start to look for thematic drivers of risk. So what I'm talking about here is things like pressure to hit targets, hit timeframes, knowledge. Do people know what's expected of them, where to go? Do they have access to the resources and support they have? Do they perceive management to be accountable? Is there trust? If I speak up, I'll be protected. They trust the organization will investigate. And you can do like specific interventions on this sort of behavioral side of things. And I've done it with organizations that often have kind of hit a risk wall where they have a lot of stuff, but it's still not quite working. And they want to understand that kind of driver of risk element. And so if we understand, because those always span silos. So, you look at all of the examples that are getting quoted and published all over LinkedIn, like Boeing, et cetera. We're talking about pressures and drivers of risk that it doesn't almost, after a while, it could have been any one of like 5 or 10 different risks that sort of were violated. But the thematic drivers. And then the final bit, if you've got a consistent way of classifying risk, the mitigation. So you might start to see thematic things coming up around prevention, detection, and response. And where you see those things coming up, it's just making sure that the user experience, for want of a better word, is consistent for employees. So that whatever risk it is we're talking about, that when we're sending out messages, the call to action is clear, where to go to help is clear, how to speak up is clear. So we can't get away, as you said, from the necessity of having specialists deal with certain areas. So you don't want the same person who does the health and safety audit doing the anti-competition risk assessment. But that doesn't mean that they should be using different language and different methodologies, because that's where the silos become impenetrable, because then you've got data sets you can't kind of cross-verify. And again, to summarize, sources, drivers, and mitigation is where I'd see most overlap.
Here's a good question from, I think it's Ramsey is the name, but basically asking, what about inconsistent risk assessments? The company will tolerate more risk for big customers or large deals versus new customers or small deals. I would maybe even also shade it that you might have different silos assessing the same risk. They might not know it because they're siloed, but they have come to different conclusions about what the risk is. And this actually came up just the other day. I was at a session at the SCC annual conference where one compliance officer had a nightmare. They were presenting to the board and they said, well, we think this is a high risk, but the internal audit team had just briefed the board earlier today, same risk, said we think it's low. They didn't know. They didn't have their stories straight, I suppose. But this can go on, that you reach inconsistent or different conclusions. And what would you say about how to avoid that? I don't know if it's, do you call one right or one wrong, or do you have a consensus meeting to split the middle, or what do you think about that sort of concern?
That's really complicated. So I think I was looking at some of the other questions, and one of Divya's ones also, my answer might speak slightly to that as well, which was around can organizations ensure that their risk assessment practices are ethical and unbiased? So if you're talking about like a natural bias between the people doing it. And so you may be wondering why there's kind of slides that I'm not using. Is because I only wanted to use them if they were relevant. And so the first one I'm just going to push to people now. I appreciate we're not polling, but if you wouldn't mind just sticking in the chat. If I say to you, probably, what does that mean to you in terms of if you had to stick it on a scale between 0 to 100%?
Like, what is the numeric value of probably?
Yeah, so if I say that this risk will probably happen, what are you thinking in your head in terms of a sort of a hard number around that?
And people can pop their guesses into the chat and we can get on that. If I remember my accounting terminology correctly, I think it is something like more likely than not. They try to put some definitions around it, but they don't give numbers. Yeah. Here's people saying 75, 70, 60, 80.
Yeah. So so now I'm going to push another slide to you, which is a study from, hopefully it's coming up. I have to scroll up here. Yeah. So this is from a NATO study in the 60s. So this isn't new. And what you'll see is like the range for a lot of the risk terminology can be very, very broad and overlapping. And so I guess my first point, when you're trying to, I go back to basics. When you're trying to communicate to a board, boards always love numbers. So if you can have a calibration of risk that involves numerous numbers, you're going to avoid the word nuance. And that becomes even more important in organizations where people might be operating in a language that isn't their first language. And so if you can have consistency around just, and there's another reason for that, which is there is some data to suggest that at the median point, we are more accurate as a group. So that's my second point about to Divya's point about bias. If we can gather more opinions on a risk issue from the people who have knowledge of it, so the frontline staff through to those managing those risks, then with that aggregation of data at the median point, I think is you're never going to be 100% precise with these risks, but we're going to be a bit more accurate. So I'd say stick to numbers. And then if you can possibly capture the nuance of those numbers. So I'm going to share a slide now that is from a tool called Mentimeter that you may be familiar with. This is an extract from a previous session where I was asking people to evaluate current risks, and you can see the hills in the background show the dispersal. So there we can see where there is maybe divergence or dissonance, which is, to your point, Matt, that's where we need to have a conversation and understand where those different perspectives are coming from. So I think it's to try and get away from that situation where it's they're saying this, we're saying that. It's always better if we can resort to having some sort of methodology that is never going to be perfect in this space because it's humans and it's subjective, but it's at least got some rigor to it.
Gio, what do you think of this, including what is your number for the word probably?
I'm at 51%.
Okay, so I thought about that too, because if it's more likely than not, technically that's 51, but it seems really low.
Yeah.
So yeah, I thought
maybe it's at least 51%. I don't know. I mean, but if it was 95, I wouldn't say this is probably happening. I'd say it's almost assuredly happening. But I mean, it's this whole thing, right? Like we want to give structure, we want to have a clear answer, but the stuff isn't clear. And I love this slide that, or maybe it's the one that you had a second ago with the hills and valleys. Because as much as we'd like to have a clear answer and say, hey, we must do this thing because it's 51% likely, the world doesn't work like that. And I think when you're doing these assessments, we have to jump between, that left and right side of the brain maybe and say, hey, give me a rating, right? Give me a rating and here's an open-ended question. Or give me a rating and I'm going to land at an average, but that average, depending on what I'm talking about, has a standard deviation, or it might have like a little hill early on and then a big one at the end of it. And like, it's not like advice to make this easier because what I'm talking about is a hard thing, but hopefully it like brings the cortisol down a little bit to say, hey, listen, we want to be scientific about this, but a bunch of this stuff is not just a single number on a number line. Because there were some questions in the chat, and I don't know if we want to talk about this more or jump to something else in the last 6 minutes, but there were questions in the chat about, well, should we just be doing checkboxes or should we be doing open-ended questions? And I think it gets around that thing where we'd like to get to a clear answer, but sometimes like the input is not that clear, or sometimes letting people, kind of tell you the nuance that they're like kind of yes, but sometimes no, is going to get you a better action, right? The goal is not like a number on the risk assessment. The goal is to protect us against risk and support the business. So do you guys think there's anything around this, around kind of the checkbox or the number versus open-ended questions?
I mean, I would say it depends on what the risk is. Or I know that there are even some sort of academics out there that they specifically say risks are things you can put a percentage to. Uncertainty is something that you don't know. We don't know the risk of aliens landing on the White House lawn because it's never happened. But you do know the risk of when a obese smoker male in North America might pass away because we have so much data about it, and you can put percentages to it. I don't know. I think it might depend on, are you looking for a quantitative risk or are you thinking about a qualitative issue or threat? But I do not think most people think about it in those terms. But Rupert, what do you say?
So the challenge I see is maybe there's a kind of philosophical semantic side to it, which is For most of the compliance risks we're dealing with, they're binary in the sense that nobody puts in their annual report a little bit of bribery or risk tolerance for fraud, a little bit. And so the leaders, unfortunately, have to lean towards checkbox to a certain extent because they want to say, no, this doesn't exist within the organization, when in reality it might be a bit more nuanced and gray than that. And so I guess that there's it's a challenging one, but what I would I know we're short on time, so there are a number of ways you can get around like trying to get a real picture on certain risks. One of them is to destigmatize. And so, for example, in the conversation I was having today, rather than saying to people, where do you think fraud risks sit in our organization? Most of your people, this won't be their first job. They will have had other roles and maybe even proximate companies. So you say to them, in the entirety of your career and what you've seen or what you've heard from friends who work at competitors, where are we talking about these fraud risks or whatever the risk category is in our organization? So the key is to get people talking. But for the management who then wants some element of precision, the reason I'm keeping this slide up or the one that Gio likes is that I think it does help to show that the kind of the trend and the dispersal of opinions on a given topic, so that then we can start to kind of, at least we're making a decision. So I'll put this one up again. At least we're making a decision with some element of prioritization, because I guess the main thing to go, if you're talking about a risk assessment's job, yes, it is to be about helping the organization hit its objectives safely. But the other job is to prioritize. And maybe that's something we haven't talked about a huge amount in this session, but making sure that we have tools that are more accurate than not at prioritization. And for me, that's about a mixture of open and closed questions, but I'm more concerned with giving people options on how they answer. So allowing for nuanced scales, the outside perspectives, because it may be that you then have to put in your annual report something very binary, but when we're talking about actually gathering risk data from within the organization, nuance is better.
Rupert, if I could sneak in one last question, because you're right, we're almost out of time here, but I often wonder, how much is this a technology challenge that we are unable to gather the right data to make a good assessment, or how much is it a process and people challenge that if we knew what we were doing, actually the data and the tech could give us an answer, but we're not looking at it the right way, we're not thinking about it the right way? What would you say to that?
I think, again, I'll try and keep it concise, but with an example. So I was doing a project with another organization operating across the whole of Asia, and I happened to be speaking to the head of finance, who was who's Cambodian, based in Cambodia. And when we were talking about corruption risks, I said, where do you face corruption in your day-to-day life? And she was just laughed. And I said, yeah, in a lot of situations, and that's kind of unfortunate. But in that risk area, I think, if you're leveraging your people, you're going to get very, very accurate data. And that's why crowdsourcing and things like that will also reduce bias. So for risks that you can explain to a 10-year-old, and I use the 10-year-old test, I think that you go to your people, and if you've got great tech to do that, then that's where those two can marry beautifully. Where it is more challenging and where you need intelligence, and what I mean by that is gathering of intelligence, is in risks that are either very dynamic, so AI or even things like money laundering, where the scams and schemes are evolving. So you might need emerging kind of threat intelligence and that's when I go back to my terrorism days. We were always looking at the intention and the capabilities of our threat adversaries. So for those more dynamic threats, you do need to have a more intelligence-led approach and probably a more outward-looking one. For those that are broadly understood and maybe systemic in all over the world, fraud, corruption, these type of things, there I would leverage your people with tech.
All right. Well, we are out of time. Rupert Yvel, you gave us plenty of stuff to think about, a lot of positive comments from the attendees, covered a lot of ground for us. Thank you very much. And Gio, I'll turn it back to you for any closing comments or farewell, but this has been a great session.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Matt and Rupert, and thanks for everyone who's been on the Ethicsverse today. I just want to remind everyone that the point of these risk assessments is an outcome and is a goal, and I kind of think of that in 3 layers. There's the executive level. You want to give a summary. Where are the big things? There's maybe the VP level, what are we going to go do, right? What's going to be part of our compliance program? And then below that is things that we're going to keep an eye out for, or things that we need to maybe understand better when we do the other round of our risk assessment, because this process should be a living, improving thing. And if you want to learn more and get better at risk assessments, I'd encourage you to get in touch with Rupert and check out Ethics Insight. Check out his book, Bootstrapping Ethics, Integrity Risk Management for the Real World. This book is awesome, guys. If you don't win one today, you got to just go buy it. It's going to teach you how to create tangible economic returns by reducing your organization's exposure to common and not so common risks, managing conflicts, prioritizing the communities that you serve, and more. And check out Ethics Insight. Rupert's company, they help organizations make risk relevant. They're going to help you implement risk and ethics and compliance programs quickly and solve your most pressing problems that you're facing, and how to do it with less resources. That's the bootstrapping part of it. Rupert, you've been an awesome guest today. Thank you for sharing your insight. Thanks for everyone who jumped in, for all the emojis. I'm feeling pretty full now, so thanks for that. And as always, Matt, it's been a blast, man, and thanks for jumping in here.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody.